we're ready to start. So I'm really happy to welcome you all to the 5th event in our Institute's Colloquium series, Trusting Science. This is one of several colloquia over this academic year where we hope to facilitate interdisciplinary dialogue around social, political, and internal trust and distrust in science, and hopefully provide some inspiration and for further discussion and research. Before we start, a bit of admin. We will be recording the talk for publishing online, but we won't record the Q&A. So if you ask a question at the end, you can just add that to the chat or raise your hand, like the Zoom hand, and you won't be recorded. And I'd just like to thank everyone at the Institute who has been involved in organising this series. So our research group members, the administration team, our library, and our communications team. And now I'd like to welcome Laura Koik, who is the leader of the Max-Planck Research Group Practices of Validation in the Biomedical Sciences, who organised and will also introduce today's colloquium, Historicizing Trust in Medicine.
Thank you very much. And hello, also here from the Villa at the Max-Planck-Institut for the History of Science. It's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this Institute's colloquium on historicizing trust in medicine. It's kind of a continuation of the first event of this Institute's colloquium, Historicizing Critiques in Medicine, that was also organized by this research group. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Maya Goldenberg to you. Maya Goldenberg is here this morning, I have to say. She's in Canada, and she's an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Guelph. She studies philosophy of science and medicine, especially evidence and healthcare decision-making, science and values, and science in relation to the public. And she just published last year a very important book on vaccine hesitancy, public trust, expertise, and the war on science. And I will also post into the chat the link to the ebook that is available via our library. So please have a look into this very interesting book. And the reason why we invited her, and I'm very happy that she accepted our invitation, is for one, because it's of course it's a very topical entry point into trusting science after or in midst of the COVID crisis. But then too, I think it's a very interesting perspective that brings together questions from philosophy of science to history of science and sociology of science with respect to the question, what is the relationship between knowledge and trust, and what kind of knowledge do we actually need for what kind of trust? And that's exactly one of the topics that she deals with in her book, but also in her presentation today. And the presentation will be followed by a comment of Alfred Freeborn, who is a postdoctoral scholar in my research group, and he works mainly on the history of psychiatry, and is also very interested in these methodological questions of how to bring together history and philosophy of science. And now, without further ado, I would like to hand over to Maya Goldenberg, who will give a 40-minute lecture that is then followed by a comment by Alfred, and then we will open up for our Q&A.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, Lara. And thank you for everyone for being here. It is an honor to be invited and to be here participating in the Max-Planck-Institut. I only wish I could have done it in person, but well, maybe next time. Turning to my talk, Historicizing Trust in Medicine. So I'd like to give just a little bit of context for it. So there's been a lot of intellectual attention over the past 7 years or so to a seeming political shift towards populism, anti-science views, and social division in the West. The Brexit referendum should come to mind. The outcome of the Brexit referendum, the election of Donald Trump as president in the United States are treated as case studies or defining moments in our slide towards post-truth is one of the popular terms for that. Now, both events were widely interpreted as signs of the end of expertise. The editors of Nature, for example, they opined that the EU must learn from the anti-expertise narrative that drove Brexit. Meanwhile, in the US, Trump gleefully embraced this anti-expertise mantle in his victorious election campaign, saying things like the experts are terrible, and the crowd loved it. Both are political problems that resonate for those of us, for people like us working in science studies when we investigate science and values, science and society, the status of scientific experts and expertise, and of course the science industrial complex. So my talk for today is called "The End of Medical Expertise." I make that a question. Is this the end of medical expertise? And that's a question that's been asked a lot during 2 years of pandemic, where we've seen vocal opposition to public health and medical advice. That's been a steady feature of our COVID communications landscape. Here I'm bringing in some Hollywood here. Here is the actor Matt Damon in 2020. He joined the cast of the movie Contagion to make these public service announcements, pleading to the public to listen to experts on COVID. So this is just to say that this is how the current problem was perceived by many, that if we just listen to experts, things would be better. And of course, the problem is that we don't listen to experts. So since the early 2000s, I'd say, there's been academic research coming from a variety of disciplines, also popular science books and news editorials, focusing on this pressing question: why don't people listen to experts anymore? And of course, what do we do about it? And these writings, they come from psychology, they come from history, from political science and more. These writings, they usually take it for granted that expertise is dead. The death of expertise is the premise, not the conclusion. And that is because people without training and education are questioning the consensus on things like climate change, on vaccines for children, and every public health intervention during COVID. And these questioners are often non-experts. We call them armchair researchers because they go online and they figure out everything. These armchair researchers, they'll use social media platforms to present their own research. It's usually a varied assortment of scientific papers, blogs, celebrity hot takes, personal experience, and conspiracy theories. And they present their findings as if they know better than the experts. This phenomena prompted the sociologist of expertise, Harry Collins, to ask the question, are we all experts now, in a 2014 book, which you see on your screen? And the answer is surely no. Now, in my own research on the status of expertise, I go against this dominant view that expertise is dead. I don't think it is. I see vaccine refusers as recalibrating the criteria of expertise rather than rejecting expertise. I see them finding new experts in unconventional places. They find expertise among maverick scientists and medical doctors that push against the convention. They find them in alternative medicine practitioners, in radical skeptics, anyone who has been deplatformed for their public health or medical views becomes someone to pay attention to rather than someone to wisely ignore. In short, I argue this isn't the end of expertise. It is, what we're seeing here is the traditional hierarchy of experts and expertise being flipped on its head. This hierarchy that I'm referring to is pretty standard. You'll see it in various philosophies and sociologies of expertise, and it looks something like this. You put expert knowledge on top. So at the top of the hierarchy, will be someone with a PhD in the field. The insider status usually puts you on top too. Let's say you're employed in a climate science research institute or a public health agency, that puts you on top of the expertise hierarchy. So what we're looking at now is a reversal of that hierarchy. The outsiders now speak truth to the distortions that the orthodoxy are promoting. And the insiders, once the trusted experts, are promoting the interests of corporations and government elites. So suddenly they are not the experts. Those rogue or maverick experts may still have pedigree. Think about physicians who insist on unconventional views like Didier Raoult or Andrew Wakefield. Some of these alternative experts don't have that kind of status. They don't have that kind of training and pedigree. They may be celebrities with large platforms, but no training to ground their claims. Other alternative experts bank on their relatability. They are mothers, they are concerned citizens, they are internet researchers, they are people more like us, the people who don't believe everything they hear from conventional experts, but are seen as trustworthy because they are relatable. Now, when we talk about public resistance to science, we don't mean all science, but the more confined category of policy relevant science. Policy relevant science aims to improve human, animal, environmental welfare. And because of that aim, it captures public interest. This kind of research and its outcomes impacts all of us. So public policy relevant science captures this attention, both positive and negative, when the science is used to inform political debate and to justify policy action on things like climate change or genetically modified foods, vaccines, water fluoridation, and more. Even when the science is reasonably settled and the scientists have some general consensus, public resistance and conflict often will still ensue. Now, why should that be? Why isn't the convention good enough? A comment on public controversies over scientific claims, how they unfold. They can, of course, be very volatile and rancorous exchanges. They will commonly unfold in some kind of battle over scientific evidence. There might be a huge body of literature supporting the scientific consensus view, and then opponents pick out selective, even disreputable counter evidence, and then arguments over the evidence will follow. Now, defenders of the scientific consensus see public resistance to scientific claims as stemming from problems like scientific illiteracy among the general public. That's a common view, or some kind of broad cultural embracing of anti-intellectualism, which of course results in the death of expertise. So while the battle is usually over scientific evidence, does the evidence show what the scientists think it shows? The broader war is between science and nonsense, reason versus ignorance, and of course, experts and expertise. I call this the war on science in my book. Now, this polarizing discourse of us versus them, science versus ignorance, it comes across as very severe. It is described in using very extreme terms. But the authors think that public rejection of science warrants this kind of analysis and extreme kind of description. Public rejection of scientific claims and the supposed turn away from science as claimants, I'm referring to the experts, this is viewed as deeply dangerous and threatening to democracy. And this kind of anxiety is captured in the titles and subtitles of popular science books. I put a few on your screen just to give you a sense of the war and the war metaphor and the extreme anxiety that surrounds this phenomena. So you see the war on science in the title, death of expertise. The subtitles say things that threaten us all, that threatens our future, that threatens our lives. in all of these titles and in the books, of course, that you're seeing on the screen, science is assumed to cut through partisan politics and rationalize democratic choice. That's why science is so important. And it is assumed that democracy needs science to ensure social stability. And because of that, any kind of public misunderstanding of science and the death of expertise destabilizes the social order. And of course, the consequences are grave. The lines of responsibility should also be understood to be equally clear. Insofar as it's the public challenging the science, the problem is surely with those publics, while science and its institutions require little, if any, scrutiny. At most, scientists might be criticized mildly for not being better communicators. Now, in one such display, and there are many, I have files and folders full of examples. In this example here, this is Neil deGrasse Tyson. He's probably the most famous English language science communicator. He, not so long ago, he appeared on a Canadian national radio show and attributed the controversies over COVID public health measures to misinformation. This, of course, is a popular view. I'm sure you've heard it too. It's not exclusive to deGrasse Tyson. And we can agree, certainly there is a lot of misinformation available during this pandemic. But this narrowing down of the multiple complex controversies to one of misinformation is to suggest that science, scientific institutions, and scientific governance are just fine. The problem lies with the public. A further, and that is, I'm trying to say that is a problematic characterization of the problem. A further problem with this framing of science controversy is that the outcome of a war on science and the death of expertise, the problem of this framing of science controversy as the outcome of a war on science is that science, even sound science, does not cut through politics and confusion to produce optimal policies and optimal social benefit. This is to say that you can, in principle, agree to the scientific superiority of the majority opinion, say on COVID antiviral treatments and COVID vaccine safety. You can do that without supporting the presumed corollary claim that the best policies follow from the best science and that the public are the problem. I propose that if you accept the premises that science is value-laden and socially situated, both of which I think are pretty uncontroversial in science studies, if you accept those two claims, the polarities start to diminish. The popular view that there's a war on science or a war on experts becomes questionable. And same with the supportive claim that it is the public's poor science literacy or anti-science views that are the source of the problem. Instead, science and society are far more entangled. So I am working with the understanding of science, with an understanding of science as socially situated. And doing that highlights the importance of trust and credibility in the successful operations of scientific institutions, both within scientific communities and with relations to the public, science in relation to the public. I'm going to define trustworthiness in a moment, and credibility is used in the epistemology literature to refer to appearing trustworthy to outsiders. So a focus on public trust in scientific institutions, I think, better explains public resistance to scientific claims. It also redraws the lines of responsibility for those controversies. And by doing that, it can redirect public outreach, that is, how to communicate and engage with the publics about scientific issues. The short version of what I'm going to say is that because scientific institutions need public trust to achieve many of their goals, public resistance to scientific claims is not squarely a problem with the publics, but a problem with and for scientific governance. Now, my research into public resistance to scientific claims has focused on public health and on medical science, especially controversy around vaccination. You know, if you want to study a public controversy over science, why not pick one of the most entrenched disputes as a case study? That's what I did. But I still think there are generalizations that can be made to other cases and even start working out an overarching account of public resistance to science. Now, let's get to defining trust. Now, trust, of course, is a heavily theorized concept in multiple disciplines. Ethics, philosophy of science, social theory have a lot of good research on trust. Within those domains, feminist research is particularly strong on trust. I think that's because feminist research emphasizes the relational aspects of morality, of knowledge, of society, especially unequal power relationships. So there is some convergence on the definition. Trust is generally taken to mean having confidence in someone or something. Discussions about trust in the context of science usually refers to epistemic trust. To invest epistemic trust in someone is to trust them in their capacities as knowledge providers. The philosopher of science, Torsten Wilholt, he theorizes epistemic trust. And to do that, he adopts a distinction from the moral theorist Annette Beyer, where she differentiated trust from what she calls mere reliance. Wilholt argued that epistemic trust, the kind of trust in science, is about trust itself more than it is about mere reliance. It's the kind of dependence that makes the trusting person dependent on the trustee's goodwill. So even in science, we are dependent on when we trust someone, we trust them not just to be information providers, but to have the right character, to have goodwill. And this dependency on other people's goodwill will make us vulnerable. We are vulnerable to being misled or harmed by these people. So trusting others is always risky, and it is also unavoidable. And this tension between needing to do it, but knowing you might be harmed by it, invites ethical analysis. When we find ourselves in a situation where we lack adequate information to know for ourselves, and this of course happens all the time, we need to trust others to fill in that information gap. We do this knowing the risk. We know trust may be broken. So trust requires what's been described as leaps of faith in some of the sociology of trust literature. This leaps of faith idea and trust follows from the influence of George Simmel on thinkers like Nicholas Lahmann, Anthony Giddens, Guido Mollering, and Barbara Mistow. And it traces back to Kierkegaard too, for the philosophers here. Now this leap refers to the necessary bridging of an information gap in situations of risk. Epistemically dependent people will fill any perceived knowledge gap with a kind of suspension or bracketing off of uncertainties. The confidence with which the trustee leaps is captured in the expectation of the trusted expert's goodwill, or at least something like moral integrity. That's a little less demanding of an expectation than goodwill, but it still speaks to the character of the expert. There's the additional expectation that the expert will be properly motivated to act, following the philosopher Karen Jones on that. So confidence in an expert hinges on moral character, not just in the epistemic credentials of the expert. Now, there's been qualitative research into parental decision-making regarding childhood vaccines. I'm thinking about measles, mumps, rubella, the standard pediatric vaccines. There's been qualitative research in how parents decide, and that has highlighted multiple leaps of faith that parents take in the face of incomplete knowledge and, of course, anxiety over future unknowns. So parents' trusting leaps are taken or they're denied regarding vaccine advice from people they know, from relations of familiarity. They might be peers, family members, they might be your trusted health professional. And it also incorporates perceptions of the trustworthiness of the scientific bodies and institutions that, say, your health professional represents. So as a whole, trust is a means of social cohesion. I'm following Barbara Mistel on that. It's a means of social cohesion through affective commitments or emotional ties. So what's important for thinking about, let's say, vaccine acceptance, and of course, on the other side, vaccine hesitancy and refusal, is that it is not the volume of evidence that are convincing parents to vaccinate their children. It is a willing leap in favor of the scientific consensus. Similarly, vaccine hesitators and refusers, they situate themselves in different social spheres, different spheres of familiarity that disqualify the majority view on vaccines. Both the acceptors and the refusers are making these calculations, moves towards belonging in a group. They are not well explained by risk assessments, accounts of trust. Instead, I think Annette Beyer was correct to describe trust as cognitive. So there is a cognitive element, of course, but also affective and conative. By conative, I mean purposive. Now that trust is identified, we can move to trust in science. Science studies scholarship strongly advances the position that trust is endemic to science. I'm sure you've heard this before. Trust supports knowledge creation, the management of dissent, and of course, consensus building is a trust building exercise too. Yet trust within science communities operate invisibly. The lines of trust are so opaque that science is commonly thought to be rigorous because it is wary of trust. Don't listen to authority, examine the evidence for yourself. That's the popular understanding of science. And that made science studies alternative thesis very radical. The alternative thesis is that trust relations make scientific progress possible. I put up some names on your screen of the sort of proponents of this view. Of course, you'll know Chapin and Schaefer, John Hardwig, the philosopher of science, have probably argued this, the link between trust and science most strongly. Because there's too much to know for yourself, there's not enough time to test all the background assumptions, to check all features of your colleagues' work, especially in large collaborative projects. We end up trusting our colleagues in the scientific communities a lot. Trust enables much of the knowledge today that we call science. So this is all to say that behind the scenes, trust is operating. It's operating in establishing and legitimating knowledge as true and universal. By universal, I mean true for everyone, not just true for me. Now, if you move from science communities to relationships between science and the public, this epistemic dependency and trust in others or trust in experts is actually more obvious. Members of the public rely on scientific knowledge to inform everyday choices, most of our practices. We don't have the time or the skill to check every claim for ourselves, so we end up believing all kinds of claims with very limited evidence. Instead, we often look to experts for advice. And when the channels of knowledge transfer, knowledge communication work well, this move from expert advice to non-expert action can go smoothly. Public resistance to science occurs because these relations between experts and non-experts are not so secure. Now, members of the public are arguably well advised to trust scientists. The scientists have specialist knowledge that allows them to know things that non-specialists don't. The philosopher John Hardwig argued for the rationality of deferring to scientists with the relevant expertise in his well-known paper, Epistemic Dependence. And his reasoning was your chance of gaining true knowledge is better if you listen to experts than if you study for the issue and decide for yourself, assuming that you are a non-specialist in this area. The sociologists of expertise, Collins and Robert Evans, explain that those scientists, those expert scientists, have interactional expertise. That is the expertise that arises from being part of the relevant knowledge community. And that specialist knowledge makes it likely that their judgments will be better than our own. So once a consensus among experts is established, experts' claims are even more trustworthy because you've got all the scientists agreeing on something. Oreskes has argued that point in her recent book, Why Trust Science? So this is all to say that the public benefits from well-placed trust. The challenge, of course, is knowing when trust is well-placed. The risk of getting it wrong remains. And of course, we can do things to reduce that risk by assessing expert advice, where we as non-experts are presumably unqualified to assess the content of scientific claims. Because we're not experts ourselves, we can do things like evaluate the character of the scientific expert or the integrity of the institutions that they represent. The philosopher Elizabeth Anderson calls this second-order assessments of scientific claims. And she argues that it's rational to do so, and also that even if it wasn't, we do it all the time. Members of the public follow expert advice if we trust those experts to be both epistemically and morally responsible. We want some signaling that they are competent in the domain and that they are honest in their testimony. More recent theorizing on well-placed trust has emphasized the additional expectation that scientists demonstrate or display social responsibility. This added quality is more instructive to policy relevant science, of course, than other areas of science. And socially responsible science, of course, can mean a lot of things. Different theorists have different takes on that. It can mean incorporating progressive values into your scientific claims. It can be mean that you incorporate public input and that there's some kind of value concordance between scientists and the public. Kitcher makes that argument. It can mean being attentive to inductive risk, especially the public's perception of inductive risk. That's an argument made by Ertzig and Kurtalmus. I can't give proper attention to socially responsible science here and which definition is right. It's enough for us, for our purpose, just to say that public trust is determined in part by the presence of social responsibility, the perception that the scientists have this as a feature. Science needs to be well done, it needs to be reported honestly, and it also needs to be perceived as serving a social good, however that social good is defined. The rationality of following expert advice hinges on trust and credibility. Experts need to be trustworthy, and non-experts need to recognize them as trustworthy. And so this is all to say that relations of trust mediate successful exchanges between scientific institutions and the public. Now, these relations of trust do not preclude disagreement and dissent. That disagreement and dissent are, of course, present in well-ordered scientific communities. And that's because knowledge is communal. Because knowledge is produced in communities, disagreement between its members will be expected. Science even encourages it. Dissent and disagreement are usually seen as a good sign. It's a sign of healthy epistemic enterprise. So this is all to say that trust doesn't preclude disagreement. What it does do is help us manage that disagreement. Disagreement also doesn't need to undermine trust either. Now, the avenues for managing dissent and disagreement in science follow from a generally accepted democratic orientation towards truth and consensus building in science. So science is often understood as best done when it demonstrates democratic principles in its communities. It should be public, it should be accountable. And this comes from social epistemologists like Kitcher and Longino. They view these mechanisms very favorably, these democratic mechanisms, and they even make recommendations to improve the democratic tenor of science by making dissent and disagreement more robust. Do things like increase the diversity in scientific communities. That will bring in new areas of dissent and criticism. Also, we need to limit spurious dissent that is meant to be obstructionist rather than knowledge-seeking, the sort of manufacturing of doubt. Intiman and DeMello Martin, they have a book called Fighting Doubt, and that came out in 2018, they argue in their book that trying to delineate good dissent from bad dissent will ultimately fail, but that doesn't stop people from trying, because it would be so helpful if we could make a division between the two. Now, it's with these communicative practices in place that I just described, it's with these practices in place that robust scientific consensus can arise on some issues, while points of disagreement can still respectfully endure without rupturing community cohesion. Now, compare this to public controversies. Controversies on this public stage are not so well managed, which is why we experience the divisions and the rancor. We don't have comparable shared rules for the management of disagreement or for consensus building. There's no shared frames of reference. We've got facts, we've got alternative facts, we've got disagreement about which side has the legitimate science and which one is junk science. There are often conflicts of interest on both sides of the debate. So some people call this post-truth. They want to throw up their hands and say, we can't win. And as if those challenges aren't enough, the heated science controversies that may spill out onto public forums are usually not even about science, but what follows practically from accepting the science is true. If climate change really is as bad as the scientists say, what policies will be put in place? How will they impact my livelihood and my sense of well-being? Science controversies then become proxy politics, where we argue over the science. Sometimes we argue over really technical issues like calculations of COVID's rate of reproduction, or the most accurate way of measuring surface temperatures for climate analysis. But these arguments over the science are really just screens or placeholders for the values at stake and what follows from the science being true. Now, this can be a hard realization for some, that science can't guide us to good policy and right action, that science doesn't neutralize political partisanship and rationalize democratic decision-making. It is shocking to many vaccine advocates that the scientific consensus on vaccines doesn't settle public concern. Instead, even the long, robust consensus on pediatric vaccines will get positioned as one side of a debate, and scientific experts then need to insist on their own legitimacy against seemingly disreputable opponents who claim to have science and moral credibility on their side. And I think we should appreciate that surprise, because the consensus is supposed to settle debate, not invite it. It represents the majority view of those who are most suited to pronounce on the issue, after all. The consensus claims often also serve a public function to educate the public on issues, to promote appropriate response, whether that's personal or political. So the failure to achieve these aims, the failure of consensus claims or consensus documents to achieve these claims is no doubt frustrating. People will ask, doesn't the consensus deserve more deference? Isn't it the best we've got, the best approximation of scientific truth? It's produced by our best procedures and practices. The universal applicability of the findings, of course, rest in the methods of consensus building. So when the public suggests that consensus claims are somehow impartial, they are rejecting an elaborate set of epistemic, methodological, and institutional mechanisms that are meant to ensure reliable knowledge and public benefit from that knowledge. Science, of course, isn't supposed to be something you believe in or are against. True, but you do need to trust it. So what's important here is that much of what members of the public know about vaccines pivot on epistemic trust. The philosopher Ben Almasy argued the same point about our beliefs about climate change. Most of what we know and believe about climate change depends on epistemic trust. Trust in experts and trust in expert claims. So tied to these consensus claims is a claim to the epistemic and moral legitimacy of its authors and of its institutions. Vaccine hesitators and more strident vaccine refusers reject those claims of legitimacy. So what is the appropriate response when the consensus does not fulfill its function of fostering public trust? I can tell you what happens now. vaccine hesitators, I'm keeping with my example of vaccines, are ridiculed for raising concerns, questioning expert testimony, taking seriously minority dissent opinion. That's true about much more than vaccines now. All public health measures, the hashtag COVIDiots quickly became a term for anyone who resisted public health measures during the pandemic. And against this democratic tenor of science, science journalists write articles like, "This is why you have no business challenging scientific experts." And they do this to convey sincere disgust over public pushback on science. Now, we know that consensus claims are expert-generated directives for epistemically dependent outsiders. It's meant to offer scientific information that we need, but that we need to know. However, the mechanisms used to ensure the trustworthiness of that information, things like discussions at academic conference settings, replication of findings, peer review, and so on, this negotiation and the mechanisms used to ensure the trustworthiness are internal to the scientific community and are therefore largely shielded from public view. So in this final step in the expert-lay exchange, where if all goes well, the public accept the scientific consensus view, this requires some kind of trusting leap of faith that the scientific experts have done their due diligence and have reported responsibly. The trust requirement, of course, places the outsider in a vulnerable position. What if they're being misled? And there's no sympathy for that. The publics are implored to trust science, trust in a process whose trustworthiness lies in it being shielded from public opinion or from non-expert contributions. So without an eye on or participation in the innermost practices of scientific knowledge and consensus building, and with various threats of sanction for not accepting and following the findings, the publics are instructed to trust. And some people are just not willing to do so. Now, even following the majority view is rational only if we can assess the trustworthiness of the consensus. The trust needs to be well placed. So the worry from the public that say all scientists are indeed in the pockets of big pharma, if that's true, then the majority view holds no epistemic weight. That's an argument made by Alvin Goldman. So this is all to say that the trust feature, it's not a numbers game. There is an element of trust that allows a person to reasonably follow the consensus view. Now, the current climate of decision-making on vaccines and public health in general is very difficult. There are many opinions out there. Many people say they just don't know which side to believe. And it's due to poor trust that the institutions that are tasked with protecting the public good are not able to carry out their mandate by offering the definitive voice of reason. The consensus doesn't guide, let's say, parents or now the general public towards confident choices. The consensus does not fulfill its function here. It does not fulfill its public function if people are wary of the findings. Now, there are implications for this, institutional implications that I think deserve more attention. We all seem to agree that the public needs science, but my point is that it goes both ways. Science needs the publics too. Many institutional goals, scientific institutions, that is, many of their goals hinge on positive public relations. Science, of course, wants to create universally applicable knowledge, and this knowledge is only universal if it is accepted by various stakeholders. So this places a demand on scientific communities to maintain the trust of the public. I'm referring to policy relevant science, of course, where among the stakeholders, the people that you want to accept their claims are not just the other scientists in your esoteric area of research, but you need the publics too. They are stakeholders in the exercise of public health too. So policy relevant science requires that scientific claims be accepted by stakeholders that are not part of the internal community. Policy relevant science can only provide its public benefits if its institutions are regarded as trustworthy by members of the public. Public health science, for example, cannot improve public health if good chunks of the public don't want to follow their recommendations. Public health makes health recommendations and sometimes consensus claims that bank on the public's trust in the institution's conscientious and honest effort to inform and protect them. So earning and maintaining the public trust is not a side issue somehow outside of the mandate of public health. It is crucial for fulfilling public health mandates. Offering the best science and the most carefully considered directives are just not enough. The science, of course, needs to be trustworthy, but it also needs to be credible. It needs to be trusted by all public health stakeholders. And persistent vaccine hesitancy indicates that institutions have failed to elicit that kind of public trust. And that warrants self-reflections about the institutional trust building practices. Health professionals have worked hard during COVID. They have spoken on Twitter, on other social media platforms about the hardships of interacting with the public during COVID. They're, of course, expected to do the work of getting the public on board about public health measures, get the public vaccinated, and of course, they also need to take care of people that get sick. So many of these health professionals take this responsibility to inform the public very seriously. I follow many on Twitter, and they are on other social platforms too, where they take the job seriously. They try to educate the public on COVID, how to protect yourself and your community, and they try to warn us against misinformation. And it is a hard job. Many doctors and scientists have experienced online abuse, and others just get frustrated that people dispute their claims, their educated claims. How can the public be so misinformed? How can they be so hostile? So health professionals perhaps don't see themselves as filling the credibility gap of the institutional framework that they work within. Healthcare professionals remain the most trusted sources on health advice, including vaccination, especially when they have a good relationship established with their patient. But the institutions they represent are not so positively regarded. So they are filling the gap when they insist and try to convince. Now, I'll draw some conclusions just to sum up. My research on vaccine hesitancy can kind of be summed up like this. The evidence that most of the publics accept on vaccines turns crucially on epistemic trust. It is poor trust in the expert sources that fosters vaccine hesitancy. So this is all to say that consensus claims won't convince anyone if the source is not perceived as trustworthy. So to confront public resistance to science, what if we focused more on building that trust rather than educating the misinformed public or puzzling over their moral and epistemic failings? Now, doing this does not discount that public health agencies have the science on their side. It does mean that we need to recognize that the best science is not enough. This is not a war with the public. It's not a war over science. I've offered a different picture of science in relation to the public than science somehow being the firm anchor that rationalizes democratic political organizations. I think science should still be understood to hold firm ground. I'm not a relativist about the science, but the idea that somehow the evidence speaks and dictates right policy is a fiction. All evidence is open to interpretation, or let's say subject to interpretation, and political and policy decisions require numerous non-scientific considerations too. So any language of evidence-based is kind of misleading in that respect. Scientific evidence instead operates within a constellation of social influences that guide decision-making and policy formation. And it is good trust relations that ensure that science stands prominently within policy frameworks. So good relations with the public needs to be prioritized. It needs to be maintained. The current tendency of criticizing the skeptical publics for failing to appreciate the primacy of scientific reasoning or the authority of experts, it does not address the problem of public mistrust of scientific institutions. If anything, it exacerbates the mistrust by entrenching a polarizing us versus them mentality. That's it for me. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Maya. That was a great talk and very pertinent to our colloquium on trusting science to get these great definitions of trust. And now I would like to hand over to Alfred, but I would also like to already ask all of you, if you have a question to Maya, just put Q in the chat, and then I can already keep a list of speakers so that we can go into the discussion right after Alfred's comment.
Okay, thank you very much, Maya, for that wonderful talk. And as I'm aware of the time, I will be as brief as possible. I just thought, in interest of relating this back to our Institute's colloquium theme of historicizing or trusting science, and in particular now historicizing trust in medicine, I talk a little bit about the historical context of Maya's position and Maya's argument. So if I briefly just kind of summarize what I see as Maya's argument, as we've just heard in the talk and also in the book, I think it can be basically put into, I mean, the book has two parts, and in the argument we've just heard today, we sort of see the two parts. There's this first analysis of what is wrong with public health communication. It's the war on science narrative. In the book, she also lists this narratives of the ignorant public, the stubborn mind. These are the negative tropes and narratives that the public health community has been using so far. And then the rest of the book is an attempt to offer this new framework that we've heard today, that trust in science and public trust in science is a better way for framing the public health problem of things like vaccine hesitancy. And in the background of this, the historical context that Maya outlines is the shift to evidence-based everything. So the fact that policy is becoming more and more technicalized and politics has become technicalized. And that erodes public trust, creates this public trust deficit, and is part of the problem that needs to be solved. I think if I just very quickly overview the second half of the book, the key things that I took out of this is that it's this distinction between trust and the perceptibility of trustworthiness, credibility, as Maya talked about today. This is the problem, basically. Public health needs to manage its credibility image better. How do we do this? We update Robert Merton's scientific norms to include things like diversity, representation, public service. And then finally, the conclusion that we get is that epistemic trust has become the key sort of object on which public health services need to focus. So we can't just focus on information, more science. We need to cultivate this thing called epistemic trust. So I just want to put this in historical context, because I feel like while the book and while Maya's position is very much aimed at policymakers and aimed at public health services, we need to understand how what the public is, what public health is, has changed since the Second World War. And in particular, I think we need to understand how science communication has changed. To give one kind of example, I think we can see a basic broad trend from investigative journalism at the middle of the 20th century, turning at the 70s increasingly towards what could be called corporate communication or public relations of science. This attempt to basically manage the image of science in science communication. And this is obviously taking place at the same time as science becomes increasingly privatized, outsourced, and in particular with the biomedical sciences, with vaccine production, these things have become privatized, although still publicly oriented. So I think there's a case to be made that while the discussion we've had today stays within the boundaries of the contemporary biopolitical problem of how do we get people who are vaccine hesitant to trust public health, we also need to take a step back and do the historical perspective that shows us that actually aren't there perhaps structural problems with the very fact that there is a privately produced public health service that leads to problems of trust and that creates a trust deficit. So that would lead to something that struck me when reading Maya Goldenberg's book, also today's presentation, is this a crisis or is this business as usual? And when it comes to public trust, I think this is this is something we really need to reflect on. And I think also something that could be interesting is a reflection of how has the reading of this book changed since its publication, and considering the research that went into the book took place in the 5 years before the pandemic. And I'm sure, Maya, you're sick of having to field these questions, but you've now probably become a COVID expert. So we will have to address this. But I look forward massively to our discussion, but I think it would be nice if we can address, on the one hand, this question of reframing public health science now from a war on science narrative to a public trust crisis. But also let's attend to the bigger historical structural shifts that's been going on in how public health services are funded, and how science communication itself does pretty much resemble corporate communication. I mean, the fact that the conclusion of today's talk is that we need to have better public messaging to increase epistemic trust is a very different conclusion to, say, one we might have in the mid-20th century about building things like solidarity through the welfare state and through social medicine. So I think that historical shift is massive, and is something that we should put to the discussion. And in the interest of time, I will wrap up my comment there. And once more, thank you very much, Maya, for the wonderful talk.
Thank you, Alfie, and great that you timed yourself. Maya, do you want to address one or two questions? You don't have to address everything that was in the comment. You can just pick something if you want to say something to the comment.
I appreciated the comments very much. I think Alfred and I are in some agreement that there's more than just the words that we say and communications. I didn't get to say enough about this in this talk that I don't think words are enough. Instead, I tried to capture when I said public health agencies need to be trustworthy and credible. It means that they actually need to deserve the kind of deference from the public that they want. And in the book, I discuss features, and not just sort of communications features, but also structural features that have led to mistrust of institutions. And some of them actually require a kind of return to solidarity and social medicine, as Alfred nicely said. Things like financial conflicts of interest in biomedicine. I've researched this for a long time. I know, because I've read enough social science interviews and from vaccine hesitant parents, big pharma is a major stopgap for public accepting biomedical claims. Yet people in academic medicine and, of course, government don't want to do anything about it, because I think it's pretty much the people who are in power that have the ability to, let's say, change that relationship, create more safeguards between industry influence and the healthcare that the public received, don't have an interest in changing that relationship, because they are lobbied, invested in, and financially supported by it. So we end up with this weak regulatory framework, and the public are pushing back. Vaccine hesitancy is a pushback against corporatization of medicine, and it is the public couldn't be clearer about that. So I don't like sometimes when I talk about this, people want to get into arguments about whether private medicine is so bad. It's usually Americans that want to do that. Whether industry funded research has a bad rap and doesn't deserve it. It actually doesn't matter so much whether big pharma is deserving of the scorn that they receive. The question is, what do the public think about it? And the publics, who are the stakeholders in public health, are pushing back, saying we don't trust healthcare technology. We sometimes don't even trust our doctors, because we think they're in the pockets of big pharma. So that's the kind of structural changes which I see as ambitious, unfortunately unlikely to change anytime soon, but that is definitely part of the discussion about what do we do to create more trustworthy institutions.
Thank you very much, Maya, for this great discussion as well. We've now come to the end of this colloquium, so let us all clap for Maya. You've done a great job. Also, thank you to Ilana. She now posted her comment into the chat. And also a question for which I'm afraid we don't have any time anymore to go into detail for that, but it is, of course, a crucial question about the difference between expertise and science. But maybe, yeah, Maya can write something into the chat while I'll share the screen to give Annalisa Alas the possibility to announce the next colloquium.
Yeah, thanks. Very briefly, I'll basically just say stay tuned for our next event on May 31st, 2 p.m. as usual. We will have Joy Zhang as our guest. She's a sociologist from the University of Kent, and she'll talk about mistrust in a way in Chinese science. You all know there has been this massive expansion of Chinese contributions to world science in the past 20 years. And besides all the fascination, there's also a lot of suspicion and mistrust. And she will talk about how that manifests what actually is Chinese science, and also if there may be other reasons than just mistrust in the methods used in China and other things that are the basis for this mistrust. So see you again on May 31st, and thanks for today's event.
Yeah, see you again, and thank you also, everyone. And again, thank you, Maya.